Hi everyone, welcome back to a new episode of our Clean Architecture with BLoC and Flutter series. Today we're going back to our app and continuing the work. One quick thing before we jump in. These concepts can seem tricky the first time you see them. It's totally fine to rewind and watch parts again and again. The more we progress, the clearer everything will become. In this episode, we'll start to implement the presentation layer for our news feature. To scaffold BLoC files and speed up our workflow, we can use the BLoC plugin. Let's install it. I go to Settings, Plugins, and install BLoC plugin from Marketplace. After installation, we need to restart our IDE. Now we can right-click on the BLoC folder, choose New, and choose BLoC class. Here we can choose a name for our BLoC class. I name it NewsBloc. And the plugin will generate 3 files for us. NewsBloc, News Event, and News State. Let's start with News Event. You see that the base event class is marked as immutable and sealed. Now, immutable basically means that once you create an object, you can change its data. All of its fields should be final. This helps keep our BLoC logic predictable because events represent something that already happened, not something that can change later. And sealed means this class can only be extended inside the same file or library. So we have full control over all possible event types, and Dart can actually warn us if we forget to handle one of them. It also prevents someone from creating random new event classes somewhere else in the project, which is really nice for keeping things organized and safe. This file will contain all the different events that can happen in our news feature. For example, in our app, we'll have an event for fetching news from the API. We can simply define it right here like this. Class load news event that extends from news event. By keeping all events together in this file, it's very easy to see what kind of actions our BLoC can respond to, like loading data, refreshing, or filtering news later on. Next, we add a field called category, and we pass it through the constructor. We do this because when we load the news, we need to know which category we're loading. For example, sports, business, or technology. So we receive that here in the constructor. Before we continue, make sure that you added Flutter BLoC to your project. Now let's run pub-get to get packages. Now it's time for our main class, the NewsBloc. As you can see, it extends the BLoC class, which takes a news event as input and returns a news state as output. The main difference between BLoC and Qubit is that BLoC works with streams of events and streams of states. So it can handle multiple types of events and manage more complex logic. While in Qubit, we only had direct method calls like increment or emit. In BLoC, everything happens through events. Each event triggers a specific piece of logic, and that logic emits new states. Here in the constructor, the default state is set to news initial, which you can find it in the newsstate.dart file that was automatically generated by the BLoC plugin. The plugin adds this as the initial state of our blog by default, but later we'll replace it with our own custom states. And inside the NewsBloc class, for every event we define in NewsEvent class, we need a corresponding handler like this in our NewsBloc. This method listens to the stream of events. Whenever a load news event is added anywhere in the app, this function will automatically run. Inside this handler, we can perform our logic. For example, calling the API through a use case and then emit the states we want. For example, news are unloading, or news may be loaded, or maybe we have an error. If we define more events later, for example, refresh news event, we simply add more on methods here. For example, on refresh news event. So each event has its own dedicated handler inside the block. Now that we're familiar with news event and NewsBloc, let's move on to the news state. In this file, we define the state of our app and manage it using a status. For our news feature, we have three main statuses. Loading, when the news are being fetched. Loaded, when the news have successfully loaded. And error, when loading the news fails. We define these statuses in a separate file called news status. And then we use news state to hold and manage the current status of the app. This approach keeps our state organized, predictable, and easy to update from the block. First, we create a base class called news status. We mark it as immutable because we never want to change the status after it's created. We also use sealed so that all possible statuses are defined in this file, keeping everything organized and predictable. Next, we should define our three main statuses. First, we start with news loading. Class news loading that extends from news status. News loading represents the loading state when the news are being fetched. The second status is news loaded that represents the success state. News loaded contains the actual news data inside a news response entity. This is what will show in the UI. So here we get the news response entity inside the constructor. Finally, the third one is news error that represents the error state. It contains a message describing what went wrong, which we can display in the UI. So we get this message in the constructor. By separating these statuses, we can easily switch the UI depending on what's happening, loading, success, or error, without mixing logic and UI. Now let's jump to the news state. I remove all of these codes and keeping the part of newsbloc.dart. This makes this file part of the same library as the block. It lets the block and its state share the same library scope. Now I'm declaring the news state class. This will hold the current UI state for the news feature. And here I add a news status field. This field holds one of our news status variants, loading, loaded, or error, which tells the UI what to render. And we should get it in the constructor. Now we create the copy with method. This method is used to update the current state with a new one. In our case, it helps us update the news status when needed. For example, when the status changed to loading, loaded, or error. It returns a new news state for us. We take the new status we want to replace in the input. It can also be null, so we make it optional. Now we return a new news state with the updated status. If the past news status is null, we simply keep the previous status. This way, the copy with method lets us update only the parts we need without changing the rest of the state, because we may have more than one status in our state. But in our example, we just have a news status. Now let's go back to the NewsBloc class and complete it. Here in the constructor, we should specify the initial state of the app. I remove this default value and put our news state here. When the app starts, the news are loading, so our initial state should hold a news loading status. This ensures that the UI knows from the very beginning that the app is fetching news. Now we want to make sure that when the load news event is called in the app, it actually fetches the news. To do this, we use the GetNewsUseCase. We get it in the constructor of the block. Next, let's go into the onLoadNewsEvent event method. When this event is triggered, it means the app wants to fetch new news. So we need to enter the loading status first, so we can emit our new state. Inside the BLoC class, we can access the current state through state. And here, we use the copyWith method to create a new state with the news loading status. Let's come back to our news state. It's better to convert the news status parameter to a name parameter. Now let's call our API. First, I define a variable of type DataState. If you remember, DataState has two possible states: DataSuccess, which contains the data, and DataFailed, which contains the error message. Next, we use the GetNewsUseCase and pass in event.category. Here, event refers to our loadNewsEvent class, which carries the category of news we want to fetch. It's better to make this kind of variables private. Now we start a switch on DataState. This lets us handle each possible case separately, based on whether the API call was successful or failed. If the data state is a data successful, that means our API call returned news successfully. So we emit a new state with news loaded status. And passing in the news data from data state. This updates the UI to show the loaded news. The second case is data failed. That means the API call failed for some reason, like a network error. So we emit a new state with news error status and passing the error message from data state. The UI can now show an error message to the user. If data state doesn't match any known case, which shouldn't usually happen, we handle it in the default case. We emit a news error with a generic message. Unknown state. So the UI can handle unexpected situations gracefully. Okay, that's it. And that's how we set up the NewsBloc with events, states, and use cases to manage news fetching. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.